Well, thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, and Mr. Abramowitz, thank you for the work of Freedom House. If we were just kind of ballpark estimating between the year 2000 and 2023 the increase in transnational repression actions within the United States, how would you characterize that?
It's hard for me to give you. I mean, what I can tell you is the facts. You know, we've documented this since 2014. We've documented 850 different cases. We'll be out in January with an update to our report. I expect there to be many, many more cases. I mean, this is a very old tactic. Dates, you know, the murder of Trotsky in Mexico is. Okay, well, but I think what I would say is that the conditions are and the belligerence of the authoritarian countries is just definitely increasing.
Well, it certainly anecdotally has in the impression is a massive increase. And one of the top actors, the top actor, according to Freedom House, is China. And on our Congressional Executive Commission on China, which I co-chair, we've had a lot of examination of this. And we realize that very few incidents get reported. But those that do get reported can range from someone walking up to a Chinese American or a Chinese national in America and saying just simply, we know who your family are back in China, and walking away. Or it might be an email that says that, or a text message that says that. And I've been pressing for the FBI to develop a much better system that and publicity in trying to collect information about these incidents. And of course, there's a trust factor that has to be established. People are afraid to report. Do you have any recommendations on how we can see more of the iceberg that is hidden from us about the extent of transnational repression going on, suppressing freedom of assembly, freedom of speech here in the United States?
Well, I would say two things. Number one, I think codify a definition of this so that everyone knows what you're talking about, and then directing the law enforcement agencies to collect that information. I think they already are doing that to some extent, but I think as my testimony indicated, we're at the tip of the iceberg.
Yeah, they're collecting very, very little. And in fact, the FBI, when I have repeatedly approached them, says, well, we're just going to tell people to call our national tip line, which is a tip line for everything in the world. There has to be some type of higher trust portal, Chinese language speaking, assurances to communities that their information is highly protected, and so forth. At least that's certainly what I've been hearing from others. I guess, would you share that perspective?
In general, yes. I think that I just will say that my team has spent a lot of time over the last couple of years briefing out the findings of our research to different law enforcement agencies. There's a huge appetite of information because I think many individual agents, you know, they'll see a case and it seems like a isolated case, but in fact, it's part of a larger national and global story. And so I think anything we can do to paint that larger picture would be very valuable.
Well, I do appreciate that you highlighted the act that a number of us have put together, including the chairman and Senator Haggerty, and the chairman now pursuing a broader bill, or I guess maybe more targeted bill, but to take on transnational repression. I think this is such an important, growing challenge. And in that context, I think many would be surprised to find that Turkey is among the top 5 offenders. Turkey, a NATO ally. Given that we have so many dynamics that interact with Turkey, including a military base there, common NATO membership, and so forth, what more can we do to bring an end to or dramatically diminish transnational repression by Turkey?
Well, as you suggest, Turkey has been on a campaign since the 2016 coup to hunt down and track its critics who are living abroad. I think it's very important for the United States to assist victims. I think it's important to not deport people back to the country of origin. I think it's a very hard challenge. We have other security interests with Turkey. You know, one thing I would just like to say, which I haven't had a chance to say today, is I think there is one silver lining to this whole situation, and it's a terrible situation, but I do think that Americans and others, because of the publicity and the greater publicity of this problem, are beginning to see the nature of authoritarian regimes. So what they understand that what happens in China is not just happening in China anymore. What's happening in Russia is not just happening in Russia anymore. You know, the rights of people inside democracies are directly at threat because of this. The free speech rights, as one of my colleagues just said. So I think it's a very important point. So I think anything we can do to get more information out about the size of this phenomenon is really important.
I'll just close by noting that among the recommendations you had was for us to provide permanent legal protection to human rights defenders, to journalists who are under attack, and I certainly would second that. Thank you very much.
Senator Shaheen.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you to each of you for being here and for your ongoing work. Mr. Abramowitz, in your opening statement, you mentioned Belarus, I believe, as one of the top 10 countries that is behaving in a way that promotes transnational crime. Yesterday, I had an opportunity to meet with Svetlana Tikhanovskaya, who is here. She is, I think most of us believe she is the real leader of Belarus, having won that election against Lukashenko in 2020. Her husband has been in prison since that time for his effort to try and challenge Lukashenko, and she was recently sentenced in absentia to 15 years in prison. Can you talk about, and I would ask each of you on the panel if you have thoughts about this, about whether you see regimes like Lukashenko working with the Kremlin mimicking what Putin has done, or are these efforts by authoritarian leaders to work together to deploy intimidation tactics and do all of the detentions, acts of violence, all of the things that you all have outlined?
Well, first of all, thank you for that question. We actually at Freedom House yesterday welcomed Natalia Pinchuk, the wife of the Nobel Prize winner, Mr. Belyatsky, to Freedom House.
Yes, I had a chance to meet with her as well.
It's a heart-rending story. They're not just her husband, who's in a penal colony, but 1,500 other Belarusian political prisoners. The point that I would simply make is that the autocrats are learning from each other. Putin was the original kind of modern-day autocrat, and his tactics are being copied by other autocrats, including Lukashenko, and including one of the most brazen cases of transnational oppression. You know, the forcing down of the airplane so he could arrest the blogger.
Do either of the other panelists have thoughts on this?
I would completely agree with Mr. Abramowitz. It's a copycat situation, especially with Lukashenko. Although he was chronologically before Putin, created his model before Putin. But what has to be clear is that there's no assumed collaboration between them. There is actually a lot of distrust, and this is something that can be used in thinking how to maybe topple this autocracy on a smaller scale. Now, Russia does not trust Lukashenko's own loyalty forever, and Lukashenko himself does not trust that Russia will not overtake Belarus and make him just a figurehead. This is an important discord that is not it's latent. It's under the surface. We've seen evidence of this on the surface. For example, when Lukashenko arrested 33 Russian mercenaries thinking that they were sent by the Kremlin to topple him just before the elections in 2020. This is a good example of the paranoia that is in his head. There's occasional collaboration between the intelligence services, but there's generally distrust. And we've seen cases where Russia has sent their own agents to actually watch over what Lukashenko says, what member of his government says at certain press conferences, because they do not trust him. And again, this is an opportunity as much as a threat.
Thank you. Ms. Gallagher, I actually have a different question for you, because I think you suggested the idea of a special envoy for transnational repression. And I'm not sure which of you talked about improper detentions, illegal detentions of American citizens, and having worked on some of those early cases and helping to develop legislation around creating a fusion cell here to support victims of that kind of repression. Can you talk about what more we ought to be thinking about in terms of supporting victims, not just going after the perpetrators, but what can we do to support victims and their families? And I really like the idea of the special envoy. I think that makes a lot of sense.
Well, first of all, thank you very much for the very important work that you've done in this space. Unfortunately, in my work, I often deal with journalists, human rights defenders, pro-democracy activists, bloggers, cartoonists who are arbitrarily detained by authoritarian regimes for doing their work. And one of the difficulties you have is that you can't, as a lawyer, use the usual legal tools you have because you're dealing with a regime which doesn't play by the rules. These are not rule of law compliant countries. And one of the things where I think the US has shown real leadership is in centralising its learning in those cases. I do think the Special Envoy works very well. I met with him recently, and indeed I understand he's in the UK today giving evidence. There's no equivalent role in the UK. So what I see time and again in the UK is the complete blank sheet when you have a case like this, which is very problematic. The other issue that we have, and Jimmy Lai is a good example of this, is that sometimes there is a lack of awareness that when you're dealing with Hong Kong, for example, you are dealing with a regime which is now in the same category as Iran, Egypt, Saudi Arabia, in these kind of cases. I do think in respect to victims, one of the real problems that I see, and this is, I see it in the UK, but also Australia and a number of other jurisdictions, there's a real lack of aftercare for victims. So quite often what you have is someone who's been subjected to arbitrary detention, the most horrendous violation of their rights, often in circumstances where they're in solitary confinement, they may have been subjected to torture and so on. When they return, the support drops off a cliff. So sometimes they're provided with very initial support from a psychiatrist or psychologist, but the gap is then filled ordinarily by civil society organisations or by fundraising. And that's a very serious problem. And I think that's one obvious area. I should also just say on the playbook question that you asked my colleagues, I think that what I'm increasingly seeing in my work and the patterns that I'm seeing is, and Belarus is a good example, whether it's working directly with the Kremlin or just simply copying the tactics, we're now seeing that there is a dictator's playbook and mechanisms which are used, which are effective in transnational repression, are inevitably going to be spreading and used by others. And it's one of the reasons why it's such a high political priority to deal with China, who we all agree is the most serious actor in this space, the most sophisticated actor in this space. And unless we treat that as the political priority which it deserves to be, we will see those tactics spreading, picked up by others, in the way that we saw Russia's tactics picked up by Belarus most graphically with that example of Roman Protasevich being hijacked in a Ryanair plane and forcibly brought within jurisdiction.
Mr. Chairman, can I ask one more question for the panel? Since you've all mentioned China, one of the things that we're seeing happening in China is a extensive collection of DNA by the Chinese. Are there ways in which you're concerned that they're going to use this database to promote the kind of transnational repression that you all are talking about? How do you see that working, or is that totally different than what you think we're dealing with now? I think as we look at AI and the prospects for AI in the future, that this is an area that we ought to be thinking about.
Senator, all I can say is that we are deeply concerned just in general about the quote-unquote bad uses of technology. We just put out a report at Freedom House. We did an annual survey of online rights. And what was very interesting about the report was it showed that, number one, traditional repression, censorship is increasing online, but also AI is now being used to kind of turbocharge human rights violations, to spread disinformation, to make it easier for the authorities to censor. So I think, in general, that's very concerning, and the collection of that kind of database sounds disturbing to me as well.
Any other thoughts about that?
I would, again, hypothetically and analytically, I would imagine that would contribute to the tool set of transnational oppression and repression, for example, by the inability of good governments to offer protection to with the usual traditional methods of witness protection, for example, because the one biometric that you cannot change is DNA. You can change the face, you can change the fingerprints, but you cannot change DNA. So theoretically, the Chinese government could use that to verify the identity of their enemies even after they've received protection.
And of course, I agree with the comments about theoretically how it could be used. I don't have any comments specifically on that issue or that database, simply because it's not within my area of expertise, but I'd be happy to look at it if helpful. I would say just generally that I think it's right that you're raising the question, because I think in relation to China, what we've seen is increasingly creative use of lawfare, weaponization of the law, increasingly creative use of technology in order to extend the long arm of the state to target people internationally, wherever around the world they may be. And it does seem to me that quite often we respond to that in a firefighting way, in a defensive, responsive way. And I mentioned earlier the enemies of freedom being creative. It's time for us to get creative too. It does seem to me that we should be preemptively thinking about what their next moves may be. So I welcome the question, although I can't give you a specific answer on it.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Senator Kaine, I was going to ask if you had anything further. Once again, let me thank our witnesses. It's clear to us that transnational regression, there's the victim, and we're obviously concerned about the individual that has been victimized by these actions, but it's also compromising the ability of the nation in which that person comes from having the type of participation that's necessary for that country's growth. And then there's also the concerns it has on our own democracies, because it denies us the opportunity to hear different views, and it compromises our own country. And we see over and over again that democratic institutions are used by our adversaries for their own advantage. This is another example where they're using our open system to gain information, to supply disinformation, in order to advance their causes. The discussions that took place just recently on the AI, you may not be aware, but every senator is going through AI 101, 102, 103, and 104. I think the last classes are this week. And we are looking at how we can get a handle on AI from a government regulatory point of view, not to stop technology, but to deal, as Mr. Abramowitz said, the bad actors and what you're seeing out there. How can we try to bring this in? So this is just an open invitation to all three of you. As we go through this process, if you see a role that we can play in Congress in the regulation of AI as it relates to this issue, don't hesitate to supply that information to us. This committee has some jurisdiction over potential bill that'll be coming out next year. There's going to be some individual bills coming out on urgent issues, but the general bill we expect to come out next year. Please give us that, because I would welcome provisions that could help us deal with this current challenge. The record, the committee will remain open until close of business tomorrow for those that might have questions. You already have a few questions that you volunteered to answer, Mrs. Gallagher. We appreciate that very much. But so the record will remain open for the questions, and then we would ask that you, to the extent the questions are asked, that you try to get replies to us in a timely way. And in concluding, just again, to thank the three of you for your contribution to these issues, to your willingness to take on an incredible challenge, and in some cases, personal risks, including, as has been pointed out, not only the individual here, Mr. Grossoff, your challenge, but Mrs. Gallagher as a lawyer, you're at risk as well. And Mr. Abramowitz, people sometimes go after the adversary groups, the groups that are trying to get the information out there. So we recognize these are challenging times. So thank you again. And with that, the hearing will stand adjourned.